Welcome to another episode of American Scandal Report, brought to you by Skoob. I'm your host, Oz Dalton, and tonight we're stepping into the shadows of American history to uncover a story that's as tragic as it is politically explosive. July 18th, 1969. While millions of Americans looked to the sky, waiting for Neil Armstrong to make history on the moon, a much darker story was playing out on a quiet island off Martha's Vineyard on a bridge in the dead of night. A young woman, Mary Jo Kopechne, would die in the waters off Chappaquiddick Island. And the man driving the car that went off that bridge? Senator Edward Ted Kennedy, the last surviving brother in America's most storied political dynasty. But what really happened that night? Why did Kennedy wait 10 hours to report the crash? Why were local authorities shut out by powerful federal agents? And how did a seemingly open and shut accident become a national scandal clouded in confusion, manipulation, and silence? Today we're diving deep into the inconsistencies, the courtroom drama, and the media storm that followed. From the whispered meetings at the Kennedy compound to the curious behavior of the Massachusetts legal system. This is not just the story of a car crash. It's the story of how influence and fear can bend the truth, and how one incident on a remote island ended one man's shot at the White House. We'll break down the coroner's report, the testimony that never made it to court, and the timeline that still doesn't add up. Because more than 5 decades later, Chappaquiddick remains a cautionary tale about how far some will go to protect power and how easily justice can drown in its wake. So sit back, because this isn't just about what happened on that bridge, it's about what didn't happen after. This is the Chappaquiddick incident, and you're listening to American Scandal Report. Picture a small cottage on Chappaquiddick Island, connected to Edgartown by a simple car ferry. Joe Gargan, Ted Kennedy's cousin, has rented this retreat for what should have been a celebration. After a regatta, 12 people gather, 6 men around Ted's age, some married, and 6 single women under 30. These weren't just any women. They were the boiler room girls, the dedicated political operatives who had worked tirelessly for Bobby Kennedy's presidential campaign in Washington. They had asked Ted and Joe to take them sailing, just like the previous summer, back when hope still lived and Bobby was still alive. Among them was Mary Jo Kopechne, 28 years old, working at a political consulting firm in D.C. A graduate of Caldwell College for Women in New Jersey, she'd volunteered for JFK's 1960 campaign and made her mark assisting with Bobby's presidential announcement in March 1968. Mary Jo wasn't your typical party girl. She was known for being the first to leave gatherings and never having more than one drink. Owen Lopez, a lawyer who dated her, described her as quiet and measured, trusted by Kennedy's staff for her loyalty and discretion. Then there's Jack Crimmins, Ted's 63-year-old driver from South Boston. More than just a chauffeur, Crimmins was an asset to the senator, not only for his driving skills but for his humor. He'd been with Ted since his days as a district attorney in Boston, taking care of the senator's 1967 Oldsmobile Delmont 88. Crimmins brought gallons of alcohol to the party, but on this night, he wouldn't be behind the wheel. The stage was set for tragedy. Among Ted's 5 male guests, alcohol flowed freely, but the designated driver was staying put. Instead, Senator Ted Kennedy himself would take the keys to that Oldsmobile, with Mary Jo Kopechne as his passenger. What happened next would haunt him forever. According to an inquest document released nearly 18 months later, Ted was driving with Mary Jo when they crashed off Dyke Bridge into 8 feet of water in Poucher Pond. The car plunged into the dark water. Mary Jo drowned. Ted survived. But here's where the story takes its first disturbing turn. Instead of seeking help from police, instead of running to the nearest house with lights on, instead of doing what any rational person would do in a crisis, Ted walked back to his friends at the party. His best friend John Tunney, who wasn't at the party, later revealed the tragic truth. Ted was poorly advised by others who had also had too much to drink. There was no one sober enough, no one clear-headed enough to insist they call the police immediately. Everything fell apart in the following hours. Joe Gargan recalls fellow party-goer Ray LaRosa, who worked for the Massachusetts Department of Civil Defense, calling him and attorney Paul Markham to the driveway, where Ted had collapsed. According to Gargan, Ted said, "The car has gone off the bridge down by the beach and Mary Jo is in it." Gargan rushed toward the bridge, but the damage was already done. In those crucial first moments after the crash, when Mary Jo might still have been saved, Ted Kennedy made the choice that would define the rest of his political life. He chose self-preservation over rescue. Deputy Sheriff Christopher Look had spotted what he suspected was Kennedy's Oldsmobile on the island at approximately 12:30 a.m. He noted that the car quickly reversed down the lane toward Dyke Bridge, the very spot where Kopechne would lose her life. The timing made it clear that Kennedy couldn't have been taking her to the ferry. The last boat had already departed. Some believe Kennedy and Kopechne had intentionally turned onto that dark, unlit dirt path with intimate intentions, either in the car or at the beach at the end of the track. Judge Boyle would later state during the inquest that Kennedy had driven over Dyke Road and Dyke Bridge twice that very day. This wasn't unfamiliar territory. Mary Jo had traveled those same roads multiple times. They both knew where they were going. 4 days later, Ted Kennedy faced the nation. In a 13-minute speech, broadcast in color on all three networks, he attempted to control the narrative that was already spiraling beyond his reach. He discussed the party for the Boiler Room girls, fervently denying allegations of being drunk or involved in any immoral conduct. He attributed his wife Joan's absence to health reasons. He recounted nearly drowning himself and admitted his failure to promptly report the accident was indefensible. But then came the moment that would be dissected by political analysts for decades. He referred to his thoughts that night as irrational and expressed feeling morally obligated to plead guilty to leaving the scene of an accident. He questioned whether a dreadful curse hung over the Kennedys, wondering if there were reasons to doubt his delayed report. Despite understanding the public's desire for his retirement from politics, he expressed his commitment to continue serving Massachusetts. He asked for advice and prayers from the public, stating the decision was ultimately his to make. It was a masterclass in political theater, but it wasn't enough. The speech raised more questions than it answered. If he was in shock, how had he managed to swim a 500-foot channel and locate his hotel? If his primary concern was Mary Jo's safety, why didn't he seek help from the nearby cottages with lights on instead of returning to the party? The contradictions were piling up, and the Kennedy magic, that indefinable quality that had carried his brothers to the highest offices in the land, was beginning to fail him. What followed was less an investigation than an exercise in damage control. Despite the controversy, Kennedy faced no further charges, though a January 1970 inquest raised more questions than it answered. John Farrar, a diver who was among the first responders, made a chilling revelation. Mary Jo had suffocated, not drowned. He claimed she could have survived if they had been notified within an hour of the accident. She had found an air pocket in the submerged car that could have sustained her for over 2 hours, while Ted was walking back to the party, while he was conferring with his friends, while precious minutes ticked away. Suspicions arose that the Kennedy family had applied subtle pressure to avoid a thorough investigation. A day after registry, Inspector George Kennedy confirmed that Edward's driving license had expired. It was mysteriously updated and fixed. Edward's history of driving offences wasn't presented in court because his driving record had conveniently disappeared from the system. No autopsy was performed on Mary Jo, sparking public outrage. A motion to exhume her body was successfully contested by her lawyer, Joseph Flanagan, who was hired and paid for by Teddy Kennedy. Leo Damore's book, Senatorial Privilege, published almost 20 years later, revealed what many suspected. Witnesses told him that Kennedy had been drunk before driving away from the party, having consumed up to 15 drinks. This led to speculation that he delayed reporting the accident to wait for the alcohol effects to wear off. When Ted returned to the cottage after the crash, Gargan later testified that Kennedy seemed primarily concerned with covering up the accident. He suggested they claim Mary Jo had been driving alone. Only at the insistence of Gargan and Markham did Kennedy report the accident the next morning, but not before having a telephone conversation with his family. While Kennedy was at the police station on July 19th, Gargan was busy cleaning the cottage to erase any evidence of the previous night's festivities. The grand jury's foreman, Leslie Leyland, would state in 2010 that if the jury had access to the suppressed information in 1970, they would have undoubtedly charged the senator with manslaughter and possibly witness tampering. As the 1970s approached, the Kennedy family harbored hopes for renewal after a tumultuous decade. Ted's Senate seat was up for re-election in November 1970, and both he and Joan focused their efforts on connecting with voters. Ted told the New York Times he needed to demonstrate that he was dependable and had matured. He acknowledged that directly addressing Chappaquiddick wouldn't suffice. His integrity and principles needed to speak for themselves. Massachusetts voters evidently still viewed Ted favorably, allowing him to retain his Senate seat. But his Senate peers were not as forgiving as his constituents back home. On January 21st, 1971, Ted lost the race for Democratic whip to Robert Byrd from West Virginia. The whip role involves working with leadership to muster support for legislation. Ted had secured this position from Russell Long in January 1969, making this defeat particularly stinging. The press described it as a political coup that took advantage of Ted's vulnerabilities following Chappaquiddick. Byrd differentiated himself by opposing the strategy of resolving issues over cocktails, a method Ted frequently preferred. The headline in the New York Times was brutal: Kennedy ousted as whip. John Tunney noted the harsh impact of this loss on Kennedy. Despite maintaining his Senate seat, Ted was acutely aware that his broader political support had eroded because of Chappaquiddick. Some within the Democratic Party still held hope for a 1972 presidential run, speculating that with time, critics might develop a new understanding of the incident. But the damage was deeper than anyone imagined. President Nixon saw opportunity in Ted's weakness. Just 2 weeks after the whip defeat, Nixon's administration was already plotting. On June 23, 1971, Nixon's Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman, devised tactics to exploit reports of Ted's continued womanizing, suggesting they seize any opportunity to place him in compromising situations. Despite a grand jury's decision not to pursue further legal action, public opinion remained overwhelmingly critical. New York Times columnist William Safier penned an essay titled Prelude to the Bridge in 1979, highlighting Ted's pattern of questionable actions, from his expulsion from Harvard to incidents of excessive speeding in Virginia, culminating in leaving the scene of a fatal accident. Safier remarked on Ted's history. When faced with significant trouble, Ted's pattern involved fleeing, hiding, being caught, yet seemingly avoiding consequences. A former staffer of President Lyndon B. Johnson pessimistically declared this the fall of the House of Kennedy. Meanwhile, Ted's confidant Helga Wagner urged the public to forgive and forget, but the damage was spreading beyond Massachusetts. Christopher Lawford, son of Patricia Kennedy Lawford and Ted's nephew, noted that his uncle remained steadfast in his ways, which proved effective in Massachusetts, but needed to resonate on a national platform for any presidential aspirations. In 1970, Ted had selected universal health care as his pivotal issue, driven by personal motivations detailed in his 1972 book, In Critical Condition. But even his genuine policy work couldn't escape the shadow of that July night. By 1980, Ted Kennedy finally made his run for the presidency, but the campaign faced insurmountable challenges from the start. His defeat in the vital Iowa caucuses dealt a severe blow to campaign finances, making it nearly impossible to raise competitive funds. Campaign manager Stephen Smith found himself constrained by safety concerns. Secret Service agents were omnipresent due to fears that Kennedy might be targeted, making supporters and voters uneasy. The campaign leaned heavily on the Kennedy family's CAMELOT legacy. A 6-piece band would play music from CAMELOT as Kennedy made his entrance or exit at events, but instead of inspiring enthusiasm, it felt awkward and out of place. The magic was gone. By the close of 1980, most Democrats were unwilling to support Kennedy, regardless of the nostalgic appeal of CAMELOT. His greatest obstacle was the issue of character. He believed his personal life shouldn't factor into voters' opinions, that his solid Senate record should suffice. But this wasn't 1960 or 1968. Post-Watergate America demanded different standards. The lingering shadow of Chappaquiddick, combined with media scrutiny, meant the press eagerly dug up flaws Kennedy made little effort to conceal. His troubled relationship with Joan added another layer of difficulty. During the campaign, he often appeared indifferent or annoyed by her presence. Marcia Chellis noted that Joan's ability to connect with tough crowds seemed to frustrate rather than make Kennedy proud. Time magazine painted Joan harshly. Public life has not been kind to Joan Kennedy. Today she is a sadly vulnerable soul and an unknown factor in her husband's electoral campaign. They described Joan spotting Kennedy's car and reportedly muttering, "Oh Christ, here he comes. I'm getting out of here," before walking away. All these personal and public difficulties combined to crush Kennedy's presidential hopes. Despite his Senate career and family legacy, voters in 1980 demanded character and integrity, precisely the areas where he faced the greatest challenges. That's our deep dive into the Chappaquiddick incident. A story that reminds us how quickly power can unravel and how silence, in the face of tragedy, can echo louder than any confession. Mary Jo Kopechne lost her life in 8 feet of water. Ted Kennedy lost his future in the hours that followed. And what was left behind wasn't just scandal, it was a legacy forever tarnished by indecision, influence, and an unspoken fear of the truth. But this story isn't just about one man's fall from grace. It's about a political dynasty built on charisma, endurance, and secrets. It's about the decisions made behind closed doors, the coordinated spin, and the question we still ask today. If his name hadn't been Kennedy, would justice have looked different? To dig even deeper into this pivotal moment in American political history, the Kennedys' reactions to the accident, Ted's televised address, the grand jury that never materialized, and the behind the scenes PR machine that went into overdrive in the days after, and more. Head to the Skoob app now. Because Chappaquiddick wasn't just about what happened, it was about what was allowed to happen, and how sometimes the most damning truths are the ones left unspoken. Download Skoob on the App Store or Google Play to unlock the full investigation. I'm Oz Dalton, and this has been American Scandal Report. Until next time, keep asking who benefits from silence, and remember, sometimes the greatest scandals aren't hidden, they're just quietly forgotten.